Ellie's hands were already bleeding when she raised her fist to knock. Not from the cold, though the Wyoming wind cut like a skinning knife across the open range. From the wagon wheel she'd gripped so hard on the last mile that the splintered wood had torn her palms rather than let her fall. She didn't knock. She pounded. 3 times, hard as she could manage. When the door swung open and lantern light spilled across the porch, Callum Wade didn't see a mail-order bride standing in the dark. He saw a woman who had already decided she would rather die on his steps than go back to where she came from. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The letter had said her name was Eleanor Marsh, that she was 24 years old, educated, capable of hard work, and available for an honest arrangement. It had said she was traveling alone from Denver and would arrive on the Thursday stage. It had not said she would arrive 2 days early on foot for the last 3 miles with no luggage except a worn leather bag clutched against her chest like it was the only thing left in the world that belonged to her. Callum stood in the doorway of the ranch house and looked at the woman on his porch. The lantern threw orange light across her face. High cheekbones, gray eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that had learned to give nothing away. Her dress was dark blue and patched at one shoulder, and she was holding herself very straight in the way people hold themselves straight when they are trying to make you think they are not about to collapse. He looked at her hands. The left one was wrapped in a strip torn from her petticoat. The right one was bare, and the palm was dark with dried blood. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Wade." Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. "I apologize for arriving ahead of schedule. There were circumstances. Come inside. I can explain." "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked you to come inside before you fall down on my porch." He stepped back from the door and held the lantern higher. "The wind's picking up." She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked past him into the house. Callum set the lantern on the table and turned to look at her properly. She was standing in the middle of the main room, with her bag still held against her chest, taking in the space with those careful gray eyes. He watched her clock every exit. The front door she'd come through, the back door past the kitchen, the 2 windows. He'd seen men do that same inventory, men who'd spent time in places they couldn't leave. "Sit down," he said. "I'll put coffee on." "You don't have to, Miss Marsh." He looked at her. "Sit down." She sat. He put the coffee on and pulled a clean cloth from the shelf above the basin. When he came back to the table and set it in front of her, along with the basin of water, she looked at it, and then looked at him. "I can manage." "I can see that." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You can also let someone help you without it being a defeat. Those are not mutually exclusive things." Something shifted in her expression. It was very small and very fast, and she controlled it immediately, but he caught it. Something surprised. "The left hand is worse," she said. "I see that too." He waited. After a moment, she set the bag down on the floor beside her chair, unwrapped the strip of petticoat from her left hand, and placed both hands flat on the cloth. The left palm was split across the center, deep enough that it had bled through the improvised bandage twice. The right had a half-dozen splinter cuts, none serious. Callum cleaned them without comment. He worked carefully, the way he worked with horses, no sudden movements, no pressure where pressure wasn't needed. "You walked from the Milligan Crossing," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know? Nearest place a stage would have left you that has a wagon wheel with that kind of splinter pattern is the Milligan Crossing post. 3 miles. He looked up briefly. "Why'd you leave the stage?" She was quiet for long enough that he went back to work and let her think. "There was a man on the stage from Denver," she said finally. "I recognized him. He works for my uncle." "Your uncle know you were coming here?" "He does now." Callum tied off the bandage on her left hand and sat back. "How much time do we have before he sends someone?" She stared at him. "You're not going to ask what I did." Why my uncle is looking for me. Figured I'd let you tell me in your own time. He stood and went to check the coffee. Though if there's trouble coming to my property, I'd appreciate knowing the shape of it. The coffee was ready. He poured 2 cups and brought them back, and she wrapped her bandaged hands around hers and looked into it for a moment, like she was deciding something. His name is Reginald Marsh, she said. He's a pharmacist in Denver. Respected. People trust him. He took me in when my parents died 6 years ago, and I was grateful for it truly in the beginning. She paused. He put me to work in the shop, compounding medicines, keeping records, dealing with patients. I learned more in that shop than most trained physicians know about remedies and treatments. I was good at it. But he never paid me. Room and board, he said. That was sufficient compensation. And when I started asking about wages, about the right to see other people, about leaving, he showed me a ledger. Her voice went flat in the particular way voices go flat when they've rehearsed a thing so many times the feeling has been worn off it. He'd been keeping track of everything since the day I arrived. The room, the food, the clothing, every single penny with interest. According to his ledger, I owed him $460. $460. He's a precise man. Callum drank his coffee and said nothing. Last month he told me he'd found a solution. She finally looked up and met his eyes. A business associate of his, a man named Victor Slade from a town called Harlan Creek, Wyoming. Mr. Slade had apparently expressed interest in a wife, and my uncle had apparently expressed willingness to negotiate. Negotiate. That was his word. The flatness in her voice had an edge under it now, just barely audible. I found your advertisement in the paper 3 days later. I took his cash box while he was at a Merchants Association dinner, packed what I could carry, and left. Callum set down his cup. How much did you take? $80. What he owed you? A fraction of what he owed me. She held his gaze. I know what it looks like. Looks like survival to me. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Wyoming dark was absolute, no moon, just wind moving through the grass. Victor Slade. You know him. It wasn't a question. He turned back around. I know him. He runs the bank here. He's been after my land for 2 years. Wants to expand a railroad deal he's got cooking with a company out of Chicago. He looked at her steadily. You have any idea your uncle was sending you straight to the man who's trying to take my property? Her composure cracked. Just slightly, just at the edges. No. I chose your advertisement because you were the farthest from Denver with the soonest available date. I didn't know. She stopped. I'm sorry. I've walked into your house with my trouble and apparently brought more of it with me. That's one way to look at it. He sat back down. Other way is you walked into my house with skills I need and information I didn't have about a man who's been working against me in the dark. He picked up his coffee cup again. Miss Marsh, why is it you can compound medicines? I told you. I worked in my uncle's shop. I mean, what specifically can you do? She looked at him for a moment, and something in her gray eyes went from careful to considering. Wound treatment. Poultices, antiseptic preparations, stitching when stitching is needed. Fever management. I've set 2 broken bones, assisted in a difficult birth. She paused. I can identify over 60 medicinal plants by sight and prepare them correctly. I know which combinations will help and which will kill. My nearest ranch hand, Cooper, cut his leg on a fence post 4 days ago. I cleaned it and wrapped it, but it's going hot. He said it matter of fact. Infection starting. Doctor's a day's ride and I can't leave the property. She was already reaching for her bag. He watched her open it. Inside, neatly arranged, were small paper-wrapped parcels, 2 glass bottles stoppered with wax, a folded set of instruments, a slim notebook filled with handwriting so small and precise it looked like typeset. She pulled out one of the bottles and the notebook opened. It ran her finger down a page. I have raw honey and a yarrow-based drawing compound. If the infection hasn't gone to the blood yet, we can pull it." She looked up. "Where is he?" "Bunkhouse." "Take me." He stood. She stood. She was already moving toward the back door, bag in hand, and Callum Wade found himself following a woman he'd known for 20 minutes through his own kitchen, toward his own bunkhouse. And the strange thing, the thing he noted and filed away and did not examine too closely, was that it did not feel wrong. Cooper was a man of 50 with a red beard and a talent for cursing who had been with Callum since before Rose died. He looked up from his bunk when the door opened, saw Callum opened his mouth to say something, and then saw the woman behind him and closed it again. "This is Miss Marsh," Callum said. "She's going to look at your leg." "Is she now?" "Cooper." "Well." Cooper sat up carefully, his face tight with the effort. "I reckon I've been looked at by worse." Ellie set her bag on the stool beside the bunk, rolled up her sleeves, and began unwrapping the bandage on Cooper's leg, with the same no-ceremony efficiency she'd applied to everything else. Callum stood back and watched her work. She didn't react to the smell of the infection, which was not subtle. She examined the wound with her fingers, and her eyes pressed around the edges. Carefully asked Cooper 3 questions about his fever and his sleep. Then she opened the notebook, confirmed something on the page, mixed the honey and the compound in the bowl. Cooper's supper had been in, and began applying it with the kind of focused competence that was either learned or born, and in her case, Callum suspected was both. "This will draw," she told Cooper. "It will hurt more before it hurts less. Tomorrow morning, if the heat is coming down, we continue. If it's not coming down, we need to think about the doctor." "What if it is coming down?" Cooper asked. "Then you keep off it for 3 days and let me work." She tied the new bandage with a clean, precise knot. "And you don't argue with me about the 3 days." Cooper looked at Callum. Callum looked back at him. "She the mail-order bride?" Cooper asked. "Yes?" "Huh." Cooper looked at Ellie, who was already repacking her bag with the same systematic care. "You any good at biscuits?" "No," she said without looking up. "Honest anyway," Cooper said. And despite everything, despite the pain and the late hour and the infection in his leg, he almost smiled. Walking back to the main house, the wind had picked up the way it does on Wyoming nights, steady and cold, and carrying the smell of approaching weather. Ellie walked beside Callum, with her bag over her shoulder and her bandaged hands folded together in front of her. "Thank you," Callum said. "It's what I know how to do." Still. She glanced sideways at him. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Wade." "What did you expect?" The advertisement said a widowed rancher needing a practical arrangement. It said nothing about taking in a woman with a stolen $80 and a man following her from Denver. The advertisement also didn't say I'd have an infected ranch hand and no doctor for 30 miles. He held the back door open for her. "I reckon we both got more than we bargained for." Inside, she stood in the middle of the kitchen again, and this time she looked tired. The straightness had gone out of her posture just slightly, just enough for him to see what the straightness had been covering. "There are 2 rooms," he said. "You take the one on the left. I'll—" "Mr. Wade." She turned to face him. "Before I sleep, I need to ask you something directly." "All right." The advertisement said a business arrangement, companionship and practical help. "I need you to confirm that is still what you intend regardless of what my uncle told Slade about me. Regardless of whatever Slade may have offered him." She held his gaze without flinching, but he could see the effort it cost her. "I need to know what kind of house I've walked into." Callum Wade was quiet for a moment. He considered the question the way he considered most serious things, without rushing, without performing looking at the plain shape of it. "I haven't touched a woman in the way you're asking about since my wife died," he said. "I don't intend to start by forcing the matter on a stranger who just walked 3 miles in the dark with 2 cut-up hands. That's not who I am." He paused. "You're here to work and to be safe. That's the arrangement. If it ever becomes more than that, it'll be because you decide it, not me." The silence after that had a different texture than the silences before it. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." He moved toward the hallway. "Get some sleep. Morning comes early here." "Mr. Wade." He stopped. "What was your wife's name?" He didn't turn around. "Rose." "She sounds like she mattered." "More than I can say." He started walking again. "Good night, Miss Marsh." "Good night, Mr. Wade." He lay in the dark of his room for a long time, not sleeping. Down the hall, he could hear the small sounds of another person settling in the creak of the bed frame, the sound of a bag being set carefully on the floor. Small domestic sounds he hadn't heard in a year and a half. They sat in his chest in a way he wasn't prepared for. Rose. He pressed his forearm over his eyes in the dark. Rose with her red hair, and her terrible singing, and her absolute certainty about everything, who had looked at this rough, unfinished ranch and seen exactly what it could become, who had looked at Callum Wade with his silences and his stubbornness and seen exactly what he could become, who had died in the room next to this one on a February night while snow fell on the range and the baby came too early and wrong and taken with her every easy version of the future Callum had ever imagined. He was not looking to replace her. He had been very clear about that in the advertisement, and very clear about that with himself. But the woman in the next room had cleaned Cooper's infected leg with her bare bandaged hands without being asked, and had looked him in the eye and told him the truth when a lie would have been easier. And Callum Wade had spent a year and a half being a man who was merely enduring doing the work, and eating the cold meals and not dreaming. And something about the last 2 hours had disturbed that state of careful numbness in a way that made him deeply uneasy. He wasn't prepared for it. He told himself to sleep. He didn't sleep for a long time. In the room down the hall, Ellie Marsh lay on top of the quilt with her bag on the floor beside the bed and her eyes open in the dark. She was listening. Old habit. Listening for boots on floorboards, for the specific creak of a particular door, for the sound of her name said in a certain tone of voice. She heard only wind and cattle, and once the distant call of something wild out on the range. She let herself breathe. Reginald would send someone to Denver's stage offices first. He would learn she'd bought a ticket for Cheyenne. From there, he would have to ask around about where a woman traveling alone might have gone, and that would take time. Days, maybe. Possibly more. She had days. The thought of Reginald Marsh sitting in his shop in Denver, tallying up the cost of her absence in that precise, terrible ledger of his, made her stomach turn in a way that was half fear and half something harder. Something that had been growing in her for the last 3 years, every time she'd looked at a preparation she'd made, and known it was good, known it worked, known the knowledge was hers and hers alone, and then handed it to him to take credit for. She looked at the ceiling of Callum Wade's spare room. He'd said you take the one on the left. Not asked, not negotiated. Just offered straight and plain, like it was the obvious thing, like making sure she had a roof over her head was simply what a person did. He'd said, "It'll be because you decide it, not me." She'd been in Reginald Marsh's house for 6 years, and he had never once in 6 years said anything to her that put her in the position of deciding. She wasn't naive. She wasn't foolish enough to mistake one night's decency for a man's character. She'd learned that particular lesson early and painfully. But she'd also learned in that same school of hard experience to pay attention to the small, specific things. The way a man handled an animal. The way he spoke to the people who worked for him. The way he responded when something was asked of him directly. Callum Wade had looked at her bleeding hands and said, "Come inside." He had looked at her medicine bag and said, "What specifically can you do?" He had looked at her straight and told the truth about his dead wife, without dressing it up or performing grief or using it to extract sympathy, just said "more than I can say," and kept walking. That was not nothing. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Wyoming wind ran its long, cold hand across the roof of the ranch house, and somewhere in the pasture, a horse moved in the dark, and the night settled around Harlan Creek, quiet and wide and indifferent to the 2 people lying awake under it, both of them thinking things they weren't ready to think. yet both of them waiting for morning. Victor Slade's office light was still burning at that hour. It burned most nights because Slade was a man who worked late and slept little and liked it that way. He was reading a telegram when his associate knocked and entered. "She's gone from Denver," the associate said. "Took his cash and ran. Marsh thinks she went east, but the stage office says Cheyenne." Slade set down the telegram. Cheyenne. Or further. "Could be anywhere," the associate said. Slade thought about the advertisement he'd helped plant in the Denver paper 2 months ago. The careful way he'd made sure it crossed Reginald Marsh's desk. The arrangement they had come to about the woman and her usefulness and the additional leverage she would provide against a stubborn rancher who would not sell. "Wade's territory," he said. The associate looked at him. "I'd be willing to bet," Slade said, "on Wade's territory." He folded the telegram once and set it precisely in the center of his desk. "Send a wire to Marsh. Tell him I know where she is. Tell him she's not the problem. Tell him to come himself if he wants her back, and to come prepared to be useful." He stood and went to the window. "And tell him to bring the ledger." The associate left. Victor Slade stood at the window of his bank in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, and looked out at the dark main street of the town he already half owned, and thought about the pieces on the board, and how very neatly they were beginning to move. Down the street, the light in the general store went dark as Agnes Whitfield locked up for the night. She'd seen the rancher ride in 2 hours ago for lamp oil and leave again faster than usual. She'd heard through Mrs. Purdy at the dry goods that a woman had been spotted on the Milligan Road after dark, walking alone, which was unusual enough to stick in the mind. Agnes Whitfield had lived in Harlan Creek for 20 years. She'd watched Victor Slade buy up land and influence the way a man buys land and influence when he believes he will not be stopped. She'd watched good people lose their properties one by one to debts that had a way of becoming complicated at exactly the wrong moment. She'd also watched Callum Wade hold his ranch through a winter that took 3 of his neighbors and a grief that would have broken a lesser man. She stood on the dark boardwalk outside her store and looked down the road toward the Wade property. "Something's coming," she said to no one in particular. The wind agreed with her, cold and certain. Something is definitely coming. Morning came, the way Wyoming mornings came in October, fast and cold and without apology. Ellie was up before the sun had the stove lit and water heating before she heard Callum's boots on the floorboards in the hallway. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back at him. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. He came in, hung his hat on the peg by the door, and sat down at the table without comment. She noted that he didn't ask what she was doing in his kitchen, or tell her she didn't have to. He simply sat, which told her something about how he understood the terms of their arrangement, and she appreciated it more than she could have explained. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him, and poured her own, and sat across from him, and they drank in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a thing worth noticing. "I want to check Cooper's leg before you put him to work," she said. "He doesn't work until you clear it. He'll argue. He'll lose." Callum wrapped both hands around the cup. "He always argues and he always loses. It's the natural order of things on this property." Ellie looked at him over the rim of her cup. There was no smile on his face, but there was something around the corners of his eyes that was the shape of one. She filed it away. Cooper's leg was better. Not healed, not close to healed, but the heat had come down measurably, and the redness had not spread. Ellie pressed around the edges of the wound with 2 fingers, asked Cooper to flex. The foot watched his face when he did it. "You're not dying," she said. Comforting words miss. "The compound needs to stay on another day. Keep off it as much as you can manage." She began wrapping fresh bandaging. "I mean that about the weight. Every hour you spend on it today adds 2 days to the healing. I've got fence to check on the north pasture. Then you'll check it next week instead of tomorrow." She tied off the bandage. "Cooper." "Ma'am, I'm not negotiating." Cooper looked past her at Callum, who was leaning against the bunkhouse wall with his arms folded and Callum looked back at him with an expression that communicated nothing useful. Cooper sighed the sigh of a man accustomed to being outnumbered by people with better judgment than his own. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Back in the main house, Callum poured more coffee and stood at the kitchen window drinking it while Ellie washed her hands at the basin. Outside, she could see the burned shape of nothing in the north corner of the yard, where a structure had recently stood, just the charred outline of a foundation. "What was there?" she asked. Callum didn't turn from the window. "Secondary barn, burned 3 weeks ago." "How?" A pause. "Slade's been buying up properties along the creek line. Every man who sells, he gets a little more leverage over the ones who haven't. A fire here, a debt called in there, a rumor started in the right place." His voice was level, carrying the particular flatness of a man who has been angry about something long enough that the anger has become structural load-bearing. "He wants the full creek access. My land is the last piece he needs to complete the route for the railroad deal." "And you won't sell?" "I won't sell." Ellie dried her hands and turned to look at his back. "He knows I'm here." Callum turned around then. "What makes you say that?" "Because my uncle knew who you were before I got here. He knew about your ranch, your debt, your situation. He doesn't know people in Wyoming territory by accident. Someone told him." She set down the cloth. "If Slade has been working against you, if he knew about your advertisement, it's possible the two of them had a conversation about me before I ever chose your name out of the paper." The silence in the kitchen had weight. "You think it wasn't chance," Callum said. "You think Slade helped point you here." "I think my uncle doesn't do anything without a reason, and Victor Slade doesn't do anything without a plan." She held his gaze. "I think I may have run from one trap straight into another, except this one was built for you, not for me, and I'm the bait." Callum set down his cup. He walked to the table and sat down slowly, and she watched him think through it. Watched the calculation move behind his dark eyes without rushing. "If that's true," he said, "then Slade expects your uncle to come here looking for you." "Yes. And when he comes, Slade will have leverage on both sides. Your uncle's claim on you as pressure on me. My situation here as pressure on your uncle to cooperate. That would be my reading of it." Callum was quiet for a moment. "You put all that together pretty fast." "I lived with a man who thinks like that for 6 years." Her voice was steady. "I got very good at recognizing the structure of it." He looked at her, really looked at her the way he'd looked at her hands the night before, the way he looked at a horse he was trying to understand. Not unkind, just direct, taking the measure of the thing without pretense. "All right," he said. "Then we don't wait for it to come to us. We get ahead of it." "How?" "Agnes Whitfield owns the general store. She's been here longer than anyone, and she knows every deal Slade's ever made in this valley. If there's a connection between Slade and your uncle, she'll know how to find evidence of it." He stood. "She's also the most respected person in Harlan Creek, and she does not like Victor Slade. That makes her useful." "You want me to come with you?" "I want the town to see you with me. Openly in the daylight as my wife under legal arrangement." He said it matter of fact. "Not hiding in my house like you've got something to be ashamed of." Ellie picked up her bag from the floor where she'd set it. "Then let's go." Agnes Whitfield was a woman who had not been surprised by anything in approximately 15 years, but she came close to it when Callum Wade walked into her store that morning with a woman beside him who she'd never seen before. She looked at the woman the way she looked at everything, which was completely and without performance, taking in the bandaged hands and the steady gray eyes and the medicine bag and the particular quality of composure that belongs to people who have survived things by learning to be very still. "You must be the mail-order bride," Agnes said. "Eleanor Marsh," Ellie said. "Most people call me Ellie." "Agnes Whitfield." Agnes looked at Callum. "Sooner than I expected." "She came early," Callum said. "I can see that." Agnes came around the counter and looked at Ellie's hands. "What happened?" Wagon wheel. I walked from the Milligan crossing. In the dark. There were circumstances, Ellie said, and something about the way she said it, dry, economical, precisely the way Callum had said it the night before, made Agnes look between the two of them with an expression that held something closer to approval than she usually offered on short acquaintance. "Come in the back," Agnes said. "I've got a kettle on." The back room of the general store was where Agnes actually lived, in the sense that it was the room where she thought and planned and held the kind of conversations that mattered. She poured 3 cups of tea and sat down across from them and looked at Callum. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it, including Ellie's theory about Slade and Reginald Marsh and the structure of the trap as Ellie had laid it out that morning. Agnes listened without interrupting, which was one of her great and undervalued skills. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, drinking her tea. "Victor Slade had a business associate come through here in July," she said. "Well-dressed man from Denver. Pharmacist, he said when I asked. Stayed 3 days. He and Slade had dinner twice at the hotel." She looked at Ellie. "Precise man. Small handwriting." Ellie's jaw tightened. "That's him?" "Thought it might be." Agnes set down her cup. "They went to the bank both days. Closed-door meetings with Slade's lawyer present. I don't know what they discussed, but 2 weeks after that man left, Slade started pushing harder on the Creekline properties, like something had shifted in his timeline. He needed another pressure point," Callum said. "And your uncle gave him one," Agnes said to Ellie. "The question is, what exactly was exchanged? Because if there's a written agreement between them, that agreement is leverage we can use." "Slade keeps his records in the bank," Callum said. "In the safe." "Then we need someone inside that bank." Agnes looked at Ellie steadily. "You said you do bookkeeping. Your uncle's accounts." 6 years of them," Ellie said. "Slade needs a bookkeeper. His last one quit in August. I happen to know because she came to me afterward and told me things about those accounts that would make your hair stand up." Agnes paused. "He hasn't replaced her yet. Hasn't found anyone he trusts with the numbers, which is itself a telling thing." Ellie understood immediately what Agnes was proposing. She felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out. "You want me to apply for the position? I want you to consider it." "Agnes," Callum said, his voice dropping, "you're talking about putting her directly in front of Slade. If he's expecting her, he's expecting a frightened woman running from her uncle." Agnes looked at him calmly. "He is not expecting a woman who walks into his bank and asks for a job. Those are 2 entirely different things." She turned back to Ellie. "It's your decision. I won't pretend it's without risk." Ellie was quiet. She was thinking about 6 years of Reginald Marsh's ledgers, the handwriting so small and precise, the way he'd built a cage out of numbers and called it accounting. She was thinking about what she'd understood sitting in that store reading the columns, about how a man who uses numbers as weapons can be undone by a woman who understands exactly how he built them. "I need to know what I'm looking for," she said. "Forged land assessments," Agnes said. "Slade inflated the appraised value on loans he issued, then called the loans in early when the property was worth less than the inflated value. The bank took the land at foreclosure for a fraction of real worth." She paused. "That's fraud. Federal fraud, because he's operating under a territorial banking charter." "How do you know all this?" Callum asked. "Because the woman who quit told me. Because I've been watching Victor Slade for 3 years, and I am not a woman who watches without paying attention." Agnes looked at him steadily. "I've been waiting for the right piece. Someone with access and the knowledge to document it properly." She looked at Ellie. "Someone who knows what they're reading." The 3 of them sat in the back room of Agnes Whitfield's general store, while the morning light came through the small window and the tea went cold and the weight of it settled over them. Ellie looked at Callum. He was looking at his hands the way men look at their hands when they are deciding something that costs them something. "I don't like it," he said quietly. "I know," Ellie said. Slade is not a careful man in the way your uncle is careful. He's the kind of careless that becomes violent when threatened. I know that too. If he figures out what you're doing, Callum. She said his name without thinking, and it was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both heard it. He looked up. I spent 6 years being careful in Reginald Marsh's house because I had no other option. I had no one who knew what was happening, no resources, no plan. She held his gaze. This is different. I have Agnes. I have you. I have what I know how to do. She paused. I am not asking you to let me do this. I'm telling you I intend to do it. I'm asking if you're willing to work with me. Something moved in his expression. It was not the small, quick movement she'd seen the night before. It was slower and more deliberate, like a door opening on a hinge that hadn't been used in a long time. Working with you is the arrangement, he said. Then we're agreed. Agnes looked between them, with the expression of a woman who has seen many things and knows what she is seeing. She said nothing. She refreshed the tea. The walk back to the ranch was quiet. Harlan Creek's main street was starting to fill with the morning's business people she didn't know yet, whose eyes tracked her and Callum as they moved past the natural surveillance of a small town, encountering a new thing. She felt it on her skin, but kept her chin level and her pace steady. People are watching, she said. They'll watch for a week, and then you'll just be Wade's wife, and they'll find something else to watch. He touched the brim of his hat at a man crossing the street, a brief, precise courtesy. Until we move against Slade. Then they'll watch for different reasons. Will they believe it, the fraud charges? Half of them have been on the wrong end of his practices and know it. The other half don't want to know it. He was quiet for a moment. Agnes's word means something in this town. Always has. If she stands behind the evidence, people will listen. Ellie thought about that. About what it meant to have a reputation built over 20 years in one place. About the kind of trust that could only be accumulated through consistent action over time. It was a thing so far outside her own experience that she could only observe it from the outside, the way you observe a country whose language you are beginning to learn. They passed the bank. Ellie looked at it as they went by a solid brick building with a painted sign above the door, discreet and authoritative. Victor Slade's name was on the sign in gold letters. She read it once and looked away. When should I go in? She asked. Give it 2 days. Let people get used to seeing you with me first. Let Agnes put a word in the right ear that you're educated and capable. He paused. Slade values competence because he believes he can control it. He'll be interested. How do you know how he thinks? He's been trying to take my land for 2 years. You learn a man's thinking when he's working against you. His voice was dry without being bitter, the tone of a man who has made his peace with a difficulty without pretending it isn't one. He doesn't respect emotion. He respects leverage and usefulness. Walk in there and be useful. He'll do the rest. They reached the ranch gate. Cooper was sitting on the bunkhouse step in the sun, his legs stretched out in front of him, doing something with a piece of leather harness. He looked up when they came through. Legs feeling better, he announced. I can see you're resting it, Ellie said. I am resting it. I am sitting right here resting it. This harness is not physical labor, it is sitting down work, which is entirely within the terms of the agreement. Cooper held up the leather. Besides, who's going to fix the tack if I don't? Ellie stopped and looked at him, and looked at the harness, and looked back at him. Did you walk to the barn to get that? A pause. The barn is very close. Cooper. Miss Marsh, I have been working ranches since before you were born, and I have never in my life. Cooper. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. It simply became very precise in the way that a scalpel is precise. Go back inside and put your leg up, and I will bring you more harness to mend. All of it. Every piece on the property. You can sit in that bunkhouse and mend until your eyes give out, and I will count it as appropriate rest. But you will not walk on that leg unnecessarily today. Cooper stared at her. He looked at Callum. Callum was looking at the middle distance with the studied neutrality of a man who has elected not to be involved. "All of it," Cooper said. "Every piece." "Well," he considered this. "I suppose that's all right then." He stood carefully, keeping the weight off the bad leg, and maneuvered himself back through the bunkhouse door. A moment later, his head appeared in the window. "I take it back about the biscuits. Woman who negotiates like that doesn't need to make biscuits." The door closed. Ellie turned back toward the main house and found Callum watching her with that not quite smile at the corners of his eyes again, steadier this time, more present. "He likes you," he said. "He likes that I gave him something to do." She started toward the house. People who are used to working don't rest well when they're forced to stop. They need the work to feel like themselves. You give them something they can do within their limits, and they'll follow any instruction you set. Callum fell into step beside her. "You figure that out with your uncle's patience." "I figured that out watching my uncle." She paused. "He was very good at making people feel useful as long as they were useful to him. When they stopped being useful, they stopped being people." She said it without drama, the flat declarative of a thing long since examined and named. "I spent a long time learning the difference between that and actual care. I'm still learning." Callum opened the front door and held it. She went through. He followed. In the kitchen, she stood at the table with her bag and did not unpack it, and Callum stood at the window with his second cup of coffee, and the silence came back between them, but it had changed overnight, had taken on new dimensions, new furniture. It was still comfortable. It was also now the kind of comfortable that knows it won't always be comfortable and has decided to be honest about it. "Reginald will come," she said. "I know. He'll come with the ledger. He'll come with whatever arrangement he has with Slade. He'll come looking and certain, and he'll know exactly what to say to make himself sound reasonable." "I expect so. He's very good at sounding reasonable." Callum turned from the window and looked at her directly. "Ellie." It was the first time he'd used her name, and they both heard that too. "When he comes, whatever he says about you, whatever version of you he brings into this town, I need you to know it won't change what I've seen with my own eyes." She was very still. "I've seen you work," he said. "I've seen you think. I've seen you walk 3 miles in the dark rather than stay somewhere unsafe, and I've seen you sit across from Agnes Whitfield and understand the whole shape of a problem in 20 minutes and decide to walk directly into the middle of it." He set down his cup. "Reginald Marsh can say whatever he needs to say. It won't be louder than what I've already seen." Ellie looked at him for a long moment. Her chest was doing something complicated that she didn't have a clean name for. She noted it, set it aside in the notebook of her mind with all the other things she wasn't ready to examine yet. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." The not quite smile again, brief and real. "We haven't gone up against Slade." "No," she agreed. "We haven't." Outside, the October wind moved through the grass on the Wade property, and in town, the gold letters on Victor Slade's sign caught the midday light. And somewhere on a westbound train from Denver, a precise and calculating man sat with a leather ledger in his lap and counted the miles with the patience of someone who has never in his life doubted that what he wants is already his. 2 days passed, the way the first 2 days in a new place always pass, with the particular sharpness of everything being unfamiliar, and the particular exhaustion of navigating that unfamiliarity without showing it. Ellie learned the rhythm of the ranch the way she learned most things, by watching first and asking only the questions that couldn't be answered by watching. She learned that Callum started work before full light and finished after dark and ate whatever was in front of him without comment. She learned that Cooper talked constantly while working and went completely silent when something was actually wrong, which meant his silence was information. She learned that the horses in the north pasture were Callum's real work, and his real pride, 3 mares and a stallion whose lines were cleaner than anything she'd seen outside of a city stable, and that when he was with them, something in him went quiet, in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet, something closer to peace. She did not learn what he thought about at night. But she heard him sometimes, boots on the floorboards after midnight, the particular sound of a man who has given up on sleep and decided to be useful instead. On the 3rd morning, she put on her best dress, which was not very impressive, but was clean and pressed, and had no visible patches, and she pinned her hair back as neatly as she could manage, and she picked up her leather notebook and walked into Harlan Creek to apply for a job at Victor Slade's bank. Agnes had done exactly what she said she would do. Ellie knew it the moment she walked through the bank door, and the young clerk at the front desk looked up and said, "Mr. Slade is expecting you," which was not a thing that happened by accident. Victor Slade's office was at the back of the bank behind a solid oak door, and Victor Slade himself was a man of 50, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of handsome face that had probably served him very well for the first 40 years of his life, and now served as a very effective mask. He stood when she entered, which was a courtesy, and gestured to the chair across from his desk, which was a power move, and looked at her with eyes that were doing arithmetic, while his mouth did pleasantries. "Mrs. Wade," he said, "I've heard you're recently arrived." "3 days ago," Ellie said. She sat with her notebook on her knee and her hands folded over it, the posture of a woman who is here professionally, and knows it. "And already looking for work. Ranching not to your taste?" "Ranching is exactly to my taste. I'm also educated and capable of contributing to this community in more than one capacity." She met his eyes without challenge, without aggression, simply directly. "I understand you're in need of a bookkeeper." Word travels fast. Agnes Whitfield is thorough. Something moved in his face at Agnes's name, a very small recalibration. "Agnes speaks well of your abilities." "I kept accounts for my family's pharmaceutical business in Denver for 6 years. I can provide references." She paused. "Though I understand your previous bookkeeper left without providing references of her own, so perhaps references are not your primary criterion." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man recalculating an assumption. Ellie held it without filling it. "You're direct," Slade said. "It saves time." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with what she recognized as genuine assessment, the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd done since she walked in. "Your husband know you're here. My husband and I have an arrangement based on mutual respect and practical partnership. He knows I'm capable of making my own professional decisions. Most men in this territory have a different view of that." "Mr. Slade." She kept her voice pleasant. "You need someone who can read a balance sheet without making errors. Whether my husband approves of my professional activities is not relevant to whether I can do the job." She opened the notebook to a page of close-written figures. "I brought a sample of my accounting work, if you'd like to review it." He took the notebook. She watched him read, watched his eyes move down the columns with the particular speed of a man who actually understands what he's looking at. She had prepared those pages carefully, had spent the better part of an evening making sure they demonstrated exactly the right level of skill, capable enough to be genuinely useful, methodical enough to look trustworthy, not so brilliant as to look threatening. "These are pharmaceutical accounts," he said. "I can adapt the methodology to banking accounts. The principles are identical." He looked up. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. 7 o'clock. She walked back to the ranch with her hands steady and her heart going hard in her chest, and did not let herself run until she was through the gate and out of sight of the road. Callum was in the barn with the stallion when she found him. She came through the barn door at speed, and he turned from the horse with his hand still on its neck and looked at her face and said, "He took it. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Something moved through him that was not quite relief and not quite fear, a combination of both, that settled into a grim, purposeful readiness. "Agnes, no. I'll tell her this afternoon." Ellie set her hand flat on the stall door to steady herself. He's exactly what you described. Controlled, precise. He looks at people the way my uncle looks at a ledger, adding up what they're worth and what they'll cost. Did he recognize your name? The connection to Marsh? If he did, he gave nothing. She paused. But he's too careful to give something like that. I won't know what he knows until I'm inside those accounts. Callum turned fully from the horse and looked at her. She'd seen that look twice now, the direct, unhurried taking of measure, and she'd stopped finding it unsettling. It was the look of a man who believed in knowing what was actually in front of him, rather than what he expected to be there, and it was in its way one of the more respectful things anyone had directed at her in a long time. You were scared, he said. I am scared. Present tense. But you did it anyway. Scared and capable aren't mutually exclusive, she said. That's something I had to learn. He nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when something registered as true, rather than merely agreeable. He turned back to the horse and was quiet for a moment, and she stayed where she was, because the barn had a particular quality of warmth and stillness that she wasn't ready to leave. Rose was scared of horses, he said. She hadn't expected that. She waited. When she first came here, she wouldn't go near them. Grew up in a city. Never been around animals bigger than a barn cat. His hand moved in long, slow strokes along the stallion's neck. Took her the better part of a year to trust this one. She used to stand right where you're standing and talk to him from a distance. Just talk. She said if she talked to him long enough, he'd understand she wasn't a threat. Did it work? Eventually. He paused. She was right about most things like that. Patient where I'm not. She understood that some trust has to be earned at a distance before you can earn it up close. Ellie understood that he was not only talking about the horse. She didn't say so. She let it stand where it was. I'll go see Agnes, she said. I'll have dinner ready when you get back. She stopped, turned. You cook. Cold beans from a can mostly. Something genuine moved through the not quite smile. Cooper tells me that's not actually cooking. Cooper is correct. She started toward the barn door. I'll be back by 5. I'll cook. You don't... Callum. She said it without turning around. Cooking is within the terms of the arrangement. Let me cook. She heard him exhale behind her. Not quite a laugh, but close, and she carried that sound with her all the way down the road into town, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. Agnes listened to the full report without interrupting, which Ellie was beginning to understand was Agnes's highest form of respect. He'll test you first, Agnes said when Ellie finished. Give you something with a small error already in it and see if you catch it or let it pass. If you catch it and tell him you're honest. If you catch it and don't tell him you're useful in a different way. If you miss it entirely, you're not worth keeping. What do I do? Catch it. Tell him. Be exactly as competent and straightforward as you presented yourself today. Agnes poured more tea. The real accounts won't come until he trusts you. Could be a week, could be 2. You'll know when he starts leaving you alone in the office. And when he does, the back left drawer of his desk has a false bottom. His personal ledger is in there separate from the bank's official records. That ledger is what we need. Agnes set down the pot. I know it's there because the woman who quit told me. She saw him replace the false bottom one morning when he thought she'd already left. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Agnes, why didn't you do this yourself? 2 years you've been watching him. You have the connections, the reputation. I don't have the accounting knowledge to know what I'm looking at when I find it. Agnes's voice was level and without self-pity. I can read a balance sheet well enough to run a store. I can't read a fraudulent banking ledger and document it in a way that will stand up to a territorial court examination. She looked at Ellie steadily. You can. The directness of it landed cleanly. Ellie had been underestimated so many times and for so long that being accurately estimated felt almost startling, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. I'll need to copy the relevant entries. Ellie said. Not take the ledger itself. If it disappears, he'll know. Can you copy accurately from memory? I can copy accurately while reading. I'll need time alone in the office. Then we need to make sure he has reasons to leave you alone in it. Agnes leaned forward. There's a Merchants Association meeting every Thursday evening at the hotel. Slade never misses it. 2 hours minimum, often 3. She paused. Your first Thursday is in 4 days. 4 days. Ellie did the mathematics in her head the same way she always did mathematics, automatically and completely. 4 days of building trust. Performing competence, making herself indispensable. 4 days of being in the same room as Victor Slade and showing him exactly what she wanted him to see. She'd done it for 6 years with Reginald Marsh. She could do it for 4 days. What she hadn't accounted for was that Reginald Marsh arrived on the Wednesday stage. She didn't see him come in. She was at the bank working through a set of quarterly summaries that Slade had given her that morning, legitimate accounts she was fairly certain attest exactly as Agnes had predicted. She was 3 hours into the work and had found 2 errors, both small, both the kind that could be innocent or could be intentional, depending on what you were trying to do with them. She was noting the second one in her own notebook when she heard Agnes's voice. Agnes never came to the bank. They had agreed on that. So when Ellie heard her voice in the outer office, calm and carrying, she felt the information land in her body before her mind had fully processed it. She closed her notebook, set her pen down precisely, and stood. Slade was already in the doorway of his office. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, a particular careful interest, like a man who has placed a bet and is watching the results come in. Mrs. Wade, he said, it seems you have a visitor. Agnes was standing at the front of the bank, with her hands folded, and behind her, taking up the space in the doorway, the way he always took up space, filling it slightly past his actual physical dimensions with the weight of his certainty, was Reginald Marsh. He looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she registered, and it hit her in a place below thought. A purely physical response, her hands going cold, her breathing going shallow, her body remembering things her mind had spent 3 days trying to reclassify as past. Same dark coat, same precise haircut, same expression of reasonable concern that he wore the way other men wore a hat, habitually and strategically. He looked at her, and his face arranged itself into something that people who didn't know him would have read as relief. Ellie, he said. Thank God. She had been prepared for this moment in the abstract. She had rehearsed it in the practical section of her mind, where she kept the things that needed to be ready. But rehearsing a thing and standing inside it were different operations, and for 3 seconds she simply stood there, 6 years of learned reflex, trying to override 3 days of something newer and harder to name. Then Agnes took 1 step to the side, a small movement barely noticeable, positioning herself between Ellie and the door. That was all it took. Ellie felt something shift under her feet, the way ground shifts after an earthquake, rearranging itself into a new configuration. She looked at her uncle across the floor of Victor Slade's bank, and she said very clearly and without any particular heat, Mr. Marsh. The use of his last name was its own sentence. She watched him understand it. Ellie. I'm working. She turned to Slade, who was watching this exchange with the focused neutrality of a man cataloging everything. Mr. Slade, this is Reginald Marsh of Denver. He's my uncle by marriage. He has no legal claim on my person or my time. I'd prefer to finish the quarterly summaries before end of day. Slade looked at her. He looked at Marsh. He looked at Agnes, who looked back at him with an expression of absolute composure. Mr. Marsh. Slade said, his voice taking on the practiced hospitality of a man who has decided how this scene should play. Perhaps we might continue this in my office. Mrs. Wade, you may take your work to the front desk. It was a compromise that served Slade's interests. He wanted Marsh, and he wanted Ellie, and he wanted them separated until he understood the shape of the thing. She recognized it. She also recognized that taking the work to the front desk put her closer to the door, and further from the private conversation about to happen in Slade's office, which was not ideal. She picked up her papers. She looked at Agnes one quick glance, a full conversation conducted in the space of 2 seconds. Agnes gave the smallest possible nod. She had already heard what she needed to hear. She would carry it to Callum. Ellie sat at the front desk and put her pen to paper, and did not look up when Slade's office door closed behind Reginald Marsh. She wrote figures into columns with her bandaged hands, and listened to the murmur of voices behind the closed door, and kept her breathing even by thinking about a specific thing, something Agnes had said to her on the first day. The structure of the trap matters, Agnes had said, because the structure is also the weakness. Any trap built to hold someone can be turned to hold the person who built it, if you understand the architecture well enough. Ellie understood architecture. She understood that Reginald Marsh had come here believing she was cornered, that Slade had arranged this meeting believing he held the pieces, that both men had built their plans on the assumption that she would behave the way she had always behaved, frightened and reactive and fundamentally alone. What neither of them had correctly accounted for was Agnes standing in a doorway, or Cooper mending harness in a bunkhouse window, or a widowed rancher who had looked at her bleeding hands on a dark porch and said, "Come inside," who had said, "It'll be because you decide it," who had said, 2 nights later lying in the dark, unable to sleep, "I hear you in there, you know." Pacing. You don't have to pace alone. She had not known what to say to that. She had sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed her palm flat against the wall between their rooms, and after a moment she had heard him shift, and somehow that had been enough. She was not alone. She was not cornered. And tomorrow was Thursday. The voices behind Slade's door rose briefly and then subsided. Ellie wrote another column of figures. Outside the bank window, Harlan Creek went about its afternoon horses and commerce, and the long slanted light of October working its way across the street. When the door opened, 20 minutes later, Reginald Marsh came out first. He walked past her desk without stopping, but she felt his gaze on the side of her face. That familiar weight, the gaze of a man assessing what she knows and what she's planning and how much it will cost him to contain it. She did not look up from the figures. He left. The bell above the bank door rang once. Slade came out of his office a moment later and stood in the middle of the floor. She could feel him looking at her, the way she could feel Marsh's gaze, though with a different quality. Where Marsh's gaze was proprietary, Slade's was calculating the difference between a man who believes he owns something and a man deciding whether to buy it. "Finished with the summaries?" he asked. "Yes." She set down her pen and looked up. "I found 2 discrepancies, small ones. I've noted them in the margin." He took the papers and looked at the notations. His face told her nothing. "Good work, Mrs. Wade." He set the papers on his clerk's desk. "I'll see you at 7 tomorrow." "Of course." She gathered her notebook, smoothed her skirt. "Good evening, Mr. Slade." She walked out of the bank and into the October afternoon, and kept her pace measured and unhurried all the way to the end of the main street, and then she turned onto the road that ran north toward the Wade property, and she walked faster and faster still until she was moving at a pace that had nothing measured about it, driven by a cold, clean urgency that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but contained elements of both. Callum was at the gate. He was just standing there, like he'd been standing there a while, hat in hand, watching the road. When he saw her face, he straightened and came forward 3 steps. "Marsh is here," she said. "Agnes found me an hour ago." His voice was level. "You all right?" "I'm all right." She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, which was set and still, and not hiding the anger underneath it very effectively, though she appreciated that he was trying. "I didn't speak to him. I was in the outer office. He went in with Slade." "What did they say?" "I couldn't hear the specifics, but they know each other, Callum. Whatever they arranged in Denver in July, it's active. Marsh didn't come here to take me home. He came here to be useful to Slade." "Which means Slade now has your uncle as a tool to pressure you. Pressure you to pressure me." "Yes." She met his eyes. "And tomorrow is Thursday. He looked at her for a long moment, that steady, direct look that she had stopped finding difficult and had started quietly and without ceremony to depend on. "Tomorrow is Thursday," he said. "One night in that office, and I'll have what we need. And if Marsh goes to the sheriff tonight, files some kind of claim. On what grounds? I'm a married woman. I'm legally Mrs. Wade." She kept her voice steady. "He has the ledger. That's what he has. And the ledger only works if I have no one standing beside me who knows it's fabricated." "Then I'll be at the bank at 7 tomorrow morning," Callum said. "And I'll be there when you come out." It was such a simple thing to say. She had heard more elaborate promises in her life, and trusted none of them. This one, plain and specific and given without performance, settled into her chest like ballast, like weight distributed correctly, like the feeling of standing on ground that will hold. "All right," she said. He held the gate open. She walked through. Behind her, the Wyoming dusk came down across Harlan Creek, and somewhere in the hotel on the main street, Reginald Marsh sat with his precise leather ledger and counted what he believed he was owed, and Victor Slade sat across from him and smiled the smile of a man who thinks he controls the board. Neither of them was thinking about Thursday. Thursday came in cold and clear, the kind of October morning that made the air feel like glass, sharp and transparent and capable of breaking. Ellie was at the bank at 7, as she'd been every morning, and Callum was at the gate of the property watching her go, and she did not look back, because looking back was not a thing she could afford to do, and still walk forward with any kind of steadiness. Slade was in a particular mood that morning. She'd learned his moods the way she'd learned Reginald's, by the small tells he couldn't control, the way he arranged the objects on his desk, the timing of his silences. Today, he was satisfied about something which was more dangerous than his ordinary watchfulness. Satisfied men grew careless in the specific way that powerful men grew careless, believing the outcome already secured. He gave her the accounts receivable ledger for the past 6 months and asked her to reconcile them against the deposit records. It was the most complex work he'd assigned her, and she understood it as the final test, the last gate before trust. She took the ledger to the front desk and opened it and began to work. And she worked with total focus, because the work mattered, and because focusing on the work kept the rest of her mind from racing in directions that would not help her. Marsh came in at 10 o'clock. She heard the bell and looked up, and he was there, and this time there was no Agnes between them, just the open floor of the bank and the clerk at the adjacent desk, who glanced up and then went carefully back to his own work, in the manner of someone who has been told to do exactly that. Reginald Marsh walked to her desk and stood in front of it and looked down at her with the expression she knew best from him, the one he'd spent 6 years perfecting, the combination of disappointment and patience and sorrow that was designed to make the person receiving it feel both guilty and grateful that he was still willing to engage. "Ellie," he said, "I think it's time we spoke properly." "I'm working," she said. "I've spoken with Mr. Slade. He's agreed to give you a brief recess." She looked up at that. Slade was in his office doorway, and the satisfaction on his face had deepened. He wanted to watch this. He believed it would be productive for him. Ellie set down her pen. She folded her hands on top of the ledger and looked at her uncle. "All right," she said. "Speak." He pulled the chair from the clerk's desk and sat unhurried, settling himself with the ease of a man who considers every room his natural territory. "You've done well for yourself here. Better than I expected, honestly. Mr. Slade speaks highly of your work." "I'm sure he does. I want you to understand that I'm not here in anger, Ellie. I was worried. You left without a word, took money that wasn't—" He paused, adjusted the sentence. "You left in difficult circumstances, and I want to make sure you're safe." "I'm safe." "You're in a territory you don't know, married to a man you'd never met, working in a bank." His voice took on the gentle cadence she'd once found comforting before she'd understood that the gentleness was a technique. "This isn't the life I wanted for you." "What life did you want for me?" She kept her voice even. "The life where I compounded medicines you sold under your name. The life where you negotiated my future with Victor Slade over dinner in July." The shift in his face was so small that anyone who hadn't spent 6 years studying it would have missed it entirely. A fractional tightening around the eyes. A recalibration. I don't know what you think you know. I know you came to Harlan Creek in July. I know you met with Slade twice. I know that 2 weeks after you left, he began accelerating his campaign against the Creekline properties. She held his gaze. And I know that you directed me to Callum Wade's advertisement specifically, which means you either placed it yourself or paid someone who knew where it was. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate one. He leaned forward slightly. The gentleness left his face, and what replaced it was not cruel exactly, but it was honest in a way. His gentleness never was the stripped-down expression of a man who has decided to stop performing. You're smarter than this situation, Ellie. You know that. Whatever you think you're building here with this rancher and this woman Agnes and your little position at this bank, it won't hold. Slade will take the ranch. Your husband will have nothing. And when he has nothing, where will you be? With him, she said. Working the problem. That's sentiment. I raised you better than sentiment. You didn't raise me. The words came out clean and quiet and final. You used me. There's a difference, and I understand it now even if I didn't understand it when I was 18 and grateful for a roof. He sat back. Something moved across his face that was harder to read than the rest. Something she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself see. I gave you everything I had to give. You gave me work and called it love. You gave me a ledger of debts and called it family. She picked up her pen. I'm not coming back, Reginald. I'm not going to be used to pressure Callum into selling. Whatever you and Slade have arranged between you, I'm not part of it. She looked back at the accounts receivable. I have work to finish. The silence lasted 7 seconds. She counted them. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and looked down at her with an expression that had gone back to the first one. The disappointment, the patience, the sorrow. But she could see now that it was a costume and it fit him badly. You'll regret this, he said. I've regretted a great many things, she said without looking up. None of them were things I did for myself. He left. The bell rang. The clerk beside her breathed out very carefully and went back to his columns. Ellie sat with her pen against the page and did not write anything for approximately 30 seconds, giving the shaking in her hands time to work its way through her system and out. Then she wrote a figure into the column and moved to the next one and kept going. Slade said nothing about the exchange. When he came out of his office at noon and saw her still at the desk, still working something in his assessment of her, shifted, she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the visible signs arrive. He brought her coffee without being asked, set it beside her without comment, and went back into his office. It was the kind of gesture that meant she had passed something she hadn't known she was being tested on. Good, she thought. Let him think that. The afternoon moved. The clerk left at 4. The teller closed his window at 5. At 5:30, Slade put on his coat and hat with the unhurried movements of a man whose Thursday evenings were fixed and inviolable. Finish what you're doing and lock up when you leave, he said. Key goes under the shingle by the left window. You know which one. Yes, sir? Good work this week, Mrs. Wade. Thank you, Mr. Slade. The bell rang. His footsteps crossed the boardwalk outside, measured and receding. She heard them go. She counted to 60. Then she stood, went to the window, and watched him cross the street and enter the hotel where the Merchants Association met. She watched the hotel door close behind him. She went to his office. The desk was solid oak heavy, the kind of furniture that communicated permanence and authority. She went around it and knelt beside the left-hand bottom drawer, opened it, and felt along the interior bottom with her fingertips, the way Agnes had described. The false bottom was not obvious. It was very well fitted, the gap at the edge barely a fingernail's width. She worked her finger into it, carefully lifted, and there it was. The ledger was thin, bound in dark brown leather, smaller than she'd expected. She lifted it out and set it on the desk and opened it, and what she saw in the first 2 pages confirmed everything Agnes had told her, and added details Agnes hadn't known. The fraudulent assessments were there. Yes, laid out in Slade's handwriting. Inflated values, early call-ins, illegal foreclosures. But there was more. A series of entries from the past year that described something larger than individual land grabs. Slade was building a complete acquisition map for the railroad company, marking each property as secured or pending, noting the method used to secure each one. Fire, debt, intimidation. And beside two entries, a different notation, the initials RM and a dollar amount. Reginald Marsh. Paid twice for information about specific property owners. Information that had enabled targeted approaches. Her uncle hadn't just come here to retrieve her. He'd been on Slade's payroll for months. Ellie worked faster. She pulled her notebook from her bag and began copying, her handwriting small and precise. The same hand she'd developed in 6 years of pharmaceutical records. The hand that could put 50 entries on a page without losing legibility. She copied every fraudulent assessment entry. She copied the acquisition map notation. She copied both RM entries with their corresponding dates and amounts. She was on the 4th page when she heard the front door. Not the bell. The front door didn't use the bell when the key was used from outside. She closed the ledger, replaced it in the false bottom, closed the drawer, stood and picked up her notebook and was around the desk and into the chair in front of it. In approximately 4 seconds, her notebook opened to a page of figures from the afternoon's legitimate work. Slade walked into the office doorway. He stood there and looked at her. She looked back. Her pulse was moving at twice its normal rate behind her sternum, and she breathed through it steadily and looked at him with the face of a woman who has been working. "Mr. Slade," she said, "I didn't expect you back. The meeting usually runs longer." It was cut short. He looked at the desk. He looked at her. He looked at the desk again. She watched him do the calculation, the things that were different from how he'd left them. The angle of the chair, the position of the lamp, the very slightly imperfect straightness of the left-hand bottom drawer. The silence went on for what felt like a very long time. "What are you still doing here?" he asked. "I was finishing the receivables reconciliation. I wanted to have it complete for you by morning." She turned the notebook toward him. "I found another discrepancy, larger than the ones from earlier this week. I wanted to make sure I'd documented it correctly before I brought it to your attention." He came forward and looked at the notebook. The discrepancy was real. She'd found it legitimately that afternoon and held it for exactly this purpose. A genuine error in the official accounts, something that served his interests, to know about something that explained why she'd stayed late and why she was sitting in his office. He looked at the figures for a long time. "This is the Hendricks account," he said. "Yes. The interest calculation appears to have been applied incorrectly over 3 quarters. It's in your favor, but if the Hendricks family retained a lawyer, they won't." He straightened. His face had settled back into its habitual composed assessment. He was still deciding something, she could feel it, but the error in the notebook was pulling his attention in a way that was buying her time. "You're certain of the calculation?" "I've run it 4 times. He looked at her. The moment stretched. She met his eyes without challenge, without fear, with nothing but the steady professional composure she had been performing all week, which was not entirely performance, which was also something she was in fact becoming, and the distinction mattered to her even if it was invisible to him. "Leave the notebook," he said. "Go home, Mrs. Wade. I'll look at this tonight." "Of course." She stood, gathered her things, left the notebook on his desk. She walked through the outer office, through the front door, and out into the cold dark of Thursday evening in Harlan Creek. Callum was on the boardwalk across the street. He hadn't been there when she'd watched Slade enter the hotel. He'd come at some point in the last hour and positioned himself in the shadow of the hardware store overhang, visible to her, not visible to the bank windows. She crossed the street and came up beside him, and they stood together in the dark for a moment without speaking. "How long has he been back?" Callum asked quietly. 10 minutes. She kept her voice low. "He came in while I was copying." He went very still beside her. "Did he?" I was back in the chair. He saw what I wanted him to see. She paused. I got it, Callum, all of it. The fraudulent assessments, the acquisition map, and both payments to my uncle. Dates and amounts. The breath he let out was long and controlled the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a while. Agnes. Tonight, if she's still awake. This can't wait. She looked up at him. There's something else. Slade's not just acquiring land. He has a specific timeline. There are notations in the ledger about a meeting with the railroad company representative. It's in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. If he doesn't have full creek line access by then, the deal falls through. That's why he's pushing so hard. That's why my uncle is here now, because Slade is running out of time and needed additional leverage. She looked at him steadily. We have 3 weeks to file the fraud documentation with the territorial court and have it acted on before that meeting happens. Callum was quiet for a moment, looking across the street at the bank, where light still showed in Slade's office window. She could see in his face the same thing she'd seen there since the first night, the particular quality of a man who does not flinch from the shape of a problem, who looks at it straight and then looks for the path through. Agnes knows the territorial court examiner, he said. She's mentioned it twice. She's been waiting for documentation to give him. Then we give it to her tonight. They found Agnes in the back room of the store, which was where Agnes apparently always was when things were happening, as though she'd arranged her life in the specific configuration that would make her maximally useful at the moments that mattered. She looked at Ellie's face when they came in and stood up from her chair. You got it, she said. I got it. Ellie opened her notebook on Agnes's table. Sit down. I need you to understand exactly what you're looking at. Agnes sat. Callum stood at the window. Ellie talked through the entries one by one, explaining the mechanism of each fraud. The inflated assessments, the premature call-ins, the illegal foreclosures. Agnes listened with the focused stillness of a woman who has been waiting for this specific information for 2 years and intends to waste none of it. The RM entries, Agnes said. Your uncle. Paid twice. First payment in June, which is before his visit to Harlan Creek. That means the relationship predates the July meeting. Ellie looked at her. He wasn't recruited here. He approached Slade. Agnes absorbed this. He knew about the railroad deal. He knew about it, and he knew about Callum's property, and he saw an opportunity. He pointed Slade at the specific pressure points in exchange for money. She paused. And then he pointed me at the advertisement, knowing I'd land here, knowing Slade would find me useful as additional leverage. He used you as a piece, Agnes said. He has always used me as a piece. She said it without heat, the flat, clean tone of a thing fully understood. The difference now is that I know the board. Agnes looked at the entries for another long moment. She looked up at Callum. I can get this to Judge Harding in Cheyenne inside 4 days if I send a writer tonight. Harding is not a man Slade can reach. He's territorial court federal appointment. She paused. But Slade cannot know we've moved until Harding's examiner is already on his way here. If Slade finds out, he'll destroy the ledger, Ellie said, and deny everything, and will have my copies, which are compelling, but not original documents. Agnes folded her hands. We need him to believe he's safe until the examiner arrives. I go back to work tomorrow, Ellie said. Friday, same as every day. I do the reconciliation. I give him no reason to look at anything differently. And Marsh, Callum said. They both looked at him. He was still at the window, his back partly to them, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the particular held quality that she'd learned meant he was containing something. What is it? She asked. He turned around. Marsh went to the sheriff this afternoon while you were at the bank, before the merchants' meeting. I heard it from Cooper's cousin who was getting a tooth pulled in the office next door. His voice was level and cold. He filed a formal complaint. Claims you're mentally unsound. Says you had an episode in Denver before you left, and he has a physician's statement to that effect. The room went quiet. Ellie stood very still and felt the specific chill of recognizing a weapon she should have anticipated. Mentally unsound. It was the thing Reginald had threatened her with in Denver once 2 years ago, when she'd pushed back too hard about wages, when he'd said there are ways to ensure your compliance that don't require your participation. And she'd understood exactly what he meant, but had been too frightened to believe he'd actually use it. He'd been saving it. A physician's statement, Agnes said, her voice carefully neutral. From Denver. Signed and apparently legitimate, Callum said. Marsh had it prepared. Which means he had it prepared before he left Denver, Ellie said. He came here planning to use it if I didn't cooperate. She felt the shaking start in her hands again and breathed through it. If the sheriff accepts it, he can hold me for examination. Potentially remove me from Callum's custody. The sheriff is Ned Booker, Agnes said. He's not Slade's man, but he's not a man who makes enemies of powerful people either. If Marsh presents documentation, then I need to see him first. Ellie closed her notebook. Tonight. Ellie, Callum said. Tonight, Callum. Before Marsh can add anything to it, before Slade can add his weight to the claim. She looked at him. Will you come with me? He had his hat off the peg and was at the door before she finished the sentence. Agnes was already pulling her coat from the hook by the back door. I'm coming too, Agnes said in a tone that did not invite discussion. Sheriff Ned Booker was a tired-looking man of 55 who had clearly hoped to spend his Thursday evening in peace and was being denied that by the steady stream of people arriving at his office with complicated situations. He looked at the three of them standing in his doorway and rubbed his eyes. Mrs. Wade, he said. Sheriff Booker. Ellie came in and stood in front of his desk. I understand my uncle Reginald Marsh filed a complaint today. I'm not at liberty to discuss. He filed a complaint claiming I'm mentally unsound and produced a physician's statement. She kept her voice precise and direct. No emotion, just the facts arranged in order. I want to respond to that claim formally and tonight. Booker looked at her. He looked at Callum beside her and at Agnes behind them both, and the political weight of Agnes Whitfield standing in his office on behalf of something was not lost on him. She'd been in this town longer than he had, and she did not spend her credibility lightly. The statement, he said carefully, is from a Dr. Phipps in Denver. It's dated 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, I was in Denver making preparations to travel to Wyoming Territory. Ellie said. I was not examined by any physician. I have not been examined by any physician in the past 2 years. She paused. The statement is fabricated. That's a serious... I'll tell you what else is serious, Agnes said from the doorway, her voice carrying the quiet authority of 20 years of community standing. A man who manufactures a medical document to reclaim control of an adult woman he's been holding as unpaid labor for 6 years. That's serious. Booker looked at Agnes for a long moment. He looked at Ellie's hands, the bandages coming off, now the healed cuts visible. He looked at Callum, whose face communicated nothing except a readiness that was perfectly still. You're saying the statement is forged, Booker said to Ellie. I'm saying I would like to be examined by whatever physician this town has on hand tonight, and have the result of that examination entered into the official record alongside Mr. Marsh's document. She held his gaze. Let the real evidence speak. The silence in the sheriff's office lasted long enough for the fire in the small stove to snap once and settle. Doc Ferris lives on Maple, Booker said finally. He'll be at home. Then let's go, Ellie said. She was examined by Doc Ferris in his parlor, while Agnes sat in the hallway, and Callum stood on the front porch, and Booker stood in the doorway between them all. Doc Ferris was a small man of 60, with excellent hands, and the unhurried manner of someone who had been practicing medicine long enough to know the difference between what he was looking at and what someone wanted him to see. He asked her 47 questions. She counted them. He tested her memory, her reasoning, her language. He asked her to describe her journey from Denver. He asked her about her work at the bank. He asked her what she had eaten for dinner on Wednesday and she told him lamb stew that she had prepared herself with the specific quantities of the ingredients which she gave accurately. When he was done, he sat back and looked at her with the particular expression of a doctor who is about to say something inconvenient to someone. "Mrs. Wade," he said, "you are about the least mentally unsound person I've examined in a decade of practice." He paused. "You are also exhausted, mildly underfed, and carrying a level of sustained stress that would have broken a person with less self-discipline. But those are not medical impairments." He paused again. "They are the natural consequences of someone who has been living under significant duress for a long time and is now with some difficulty learning not to." She sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Get some sleep." He stood. "I'll write my findings tonight and deliver them to the sheriff's office by morning." She came out of the parlor and found Callum still on the front porch. He was standing with his arms folded and his hat in his hand looking out at the dark street, and when she came through the door, he turned and looked at her face, and something in him released slowly and completely, like a fist uncurling. "Well," he said, "not mentally unsound." She stood beside him on the porch. The October night pressed cold and close around them. Just exhausted and mildly underfed and carrying too much stress. "That's not a medical impairment." That's what he said. Callum looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He put his arm around her shoulders carefully with the same consideration he'd used that first night in the kitchen when he'd asked, "Can I?" And she leaned into it, and they stood there on Doc Ferris's porch in the dark, while Agnes spoke quietly with the sheriff inside, and the town of Harlan Creek moved around them, and somewhere in the hotel on the main street, Reginald Marsh sat with his fabricated document and his careful ledger, and somewhere in the bank, Victor Slade read figures that hid the architecture of his greed, and the rider Agnes was sending to Cheyenne was already saddling his horse. "It's almost over," Callum said. She wanted to believe that. She understood the shape of the thing well enough to know there was still distance between almost and done. But she was warm against his side in the October cold, and the physician's statement was being written, and her copies were in her notebook, and tomorrow she would go back to that bank and sit at that desk and look at Slade across the room and give him no reason to be anything but satisfied. "Not yet," she said, "but close." He tightened his arm around her, once brief and deliberate. "Close is enough for tonight." She let herself believe it. Just for that hour, just for the walk home under the Wyoming stars, just for the distance between almost and done. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The rider Agnes sent to Cheyenne made it in 3 days. Ellie knew this because Agnes told her on Sunday evening, quiet and certain the way Agnes delivered all information that mattered. Judge Harding's examiner would arrive Wednesday, 4 days away. 4 days of keeping everything exactly as it was, of going to the bank at 7 and sitting at the desk and doing the work and giving Slade no reason to look at anything twice. She managed it. She was good at managing things that required stillness while everything underneath was moving. What she hadn't managed was Reginald Marsh. He came to the bank on Monday morning and sat in the chair across from her desk for 20 minutes and said nothing about the physician's examination and nothing about the sheriff's office, and nothing about the document Doc Ferris had delivered to Booker's desk on Friday morning. He talked about Denver. He talked about the shop. He talked about a formula she'd developed for a joint preparation that had become one of his best-selling compounds, talking about it the way he talked about all her work, as though it had arrived in the world through his hands, and she had merely been present. She let him talk. She kept her pen moving. She did not look up more than was necessary to maintain the appearance of civil attention. When he stood to leave, he said very quietly, "I know you've sent to Cheyenne." She looked up then. She couldn't help it. His face was the careful one, the controlled one, but underneath it she could see something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, something older and less manageable than either. "I know you found something in those accounts. Slade doesn't know yet, but I do because I know how you work. I know how your mind moves." He paused. "I taught you that." You gave me the opportunity to develop it, she said. That's not the same thing. Ellie. He said her name the way he used to say it when she was 19 and frightened and grateful with a weight of familiarity that was designed to feel like affection. There is still a way through this that doesn't end with you destroying everything. What I'm doing doesn't destroy anything that deserves to stand. She held his gaze. The men whose land Slade took deserve restitution. The families who lost their properties because of fraudulent assessments deserve restitution. What I'm doing is giving them a path to get it. And me. I don't know what happens to you, she said honestly. That's for the court to decide. He stood there for a moment longer, and she saw it again, that older thing under the controlled surface, and she understood finally what it was. He was afraid. Not of the court, not of consequences, but of her specifically, of what she had become in the 3 weeks since she'd walked off a stagecoach in Wyoming, of the distance between the girl he'd kept and the woman standing in front of him now. He was afraid because he could see that the distance was not closable. I'm sorry, he said, for whatever that's worth. She considered it. She considered whether it was real and decided it was probably partially real, which was the most honest assessment she could give it, partially real and mostly too late. It's worth something, she said. Not enough to change what I'm doing, but something. He left. She went back to work. Her hands were steady. On Tuesday, Slade gave her the personal correspondence files to organize, which meant she was in his office for most of the afternoon while he conducted meetings at the front of the bank. She organized the files with meticulous care and found nothing incriminating, which she hadn't expected to, since the incriminating material was in the false bottom of the drawer 2 feet from where she sat. What she did find was a letter from the railroad company representative dated 6 weeks ago, confirming the Wednesday meeting and specifying that all property acquisition documentation needed to be complete and filed before that meeting, or the deal terms would be renegotiated at significantly reduced rates. Wednesday. The examiner from Cheyenne and the railroad representative on the same day. She replaced the letter exactly as she'd found it and said nothing about it to Slade when he came back into the office at 4 o'clock, and said nothing about it to Callum that evening, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she was still working out what it meant and how it changed the shape of what was coming. She lay awake for a long time Tuesday night, doing mathematics in her head, calculating timings, running through scenarios, looking for the configuration that worked. She found it at approximately 2 in the morning. She got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark and wrote it out in her notebook. The full sequence, every step, every contingency. When she was done, she read it back twice. It held. She heard Callum's door. His footsteps in the hallway, then the pause at the kitchen doorway. "You're up," he said. "I figured something out." He came in and sat across from her, and she pushed the notebook toward him. He read it in the lamplight, taking his time, and she watched his face move through it the way she'd watched him look at the ledger entries. Agnes had described the careful movement of a man who understands that getting this right matters more than getting it fast. When he finished, he looked up. "You want to be at the bank when the examiner arrives." "I want to be at the bank before the examiner arrives. I need to be in that office with the ledger open on the desk so that when the examiner walks in, the evidence is immediately visible and immediately verifiable." She paused. "If we let the examiner come in cold, Slade could deny delay, claim the ledger is a forgery, buy himself enough time to destroy it. But if I'm already in the office with it out, he can't claim ignorance. And he can't claim you or Agnes planted it because I'm his employee and I'm the one who found it in the normal course of work." She held his gaze. "It has to be me, Callum. I'm the only one who can be in that office legitimately." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, looking at the risks, not the risks he was willing to take, but the risks she would be taking. If Slade comes in before the examiner, then I tell him I found a discrepancy in the personal ledger and was verifying it. He'll be angry. He might be dangerous. She said it plainly. That's the risk. That's not a small risk. No. She folded her hands on the notebook. But the alternative is, we give the examiner the copies and hope they're sufficient and spend months in territorial court while Slade manipulates every variable he can reach. And in the meantime, the railroad meeting happens, and the deal closes, and the evidence becomes historical instead of active. She paused. Reginald told me he knows we sent to Cheyenne, which means he may tell Slade. Callum's jaw tightened. When did he? Monday. He said it as he was leaving. I didn't tell you because I was still working out what it changed. She looked at him steadily. It changes the timeline. If Slade knows the examiner is coming, he'll move the ledger before Wednesday, maybe as early as tonight. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the grass and the night pressed against the windows, and the lamp between them made a small warm island of light in the dark. What time does Slade get to the bank? Callum asked. 8. The examiner from Agnes's timeline would arrive mid-morning. I'll be outside at 7, he said. Not across the street this time, at the door. He held her gaze. If you're not out in 20 minutes after Slade arrives, I'm coming in. Callum, those are my terms. He said it quietly and completely. You do this your way. I'll do this mine. We're partners, which means you don't get to be the only one who takes a risk. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man she'd known for 3 weeks, who had opened a door in the dark and said, "Come inside," who had sat in a bunkhouse and watched her work without commentary, who had told her the truth about his dead wife with a simplicity that had no performance in it anywhere. She thought about what Agnes had said on that first morning. Some trust has to be earned at a distance before it can be earned up close. She understood that she had closed the distance. She wasn't sure exactly when, but she understood that it was done. All right, she said. 7 o'clock. Wednesday arrived cold and still, the sky the particular flat white of a morning that is considering snow. Ellie was at the bank at 6:30. She used her key, the one Slade had given her at the end of the first week, as a mark of trust, and she went in and did not light the front lamps, working by the gray morning light that came through the windows. She went to Slade's office. She went to the drawer. She lifted the false bottom and took out the ledger and placed it open on his desk, open to the first fraudulent assessment entry, the one with the clearest methodology, the one that an examiner looking at it for the first time would understand inside 60 seconds. Then she sat in the chair across from his desk, her own notebook open on her knee, and waited. Callum was at the door at 7. She could see his silhouette through the glass, steady and still, and the steadiness of it did something in her chest that she recognized by now without needing to examine it. Slade arrived at 8:10. She heard his key in the lock, heard his footsteps cross the outer office, heard him stop. She could feel the moment he noticed the office lamp was burning the small discontinuity of something not as he'd left it. His footsteps resumed deliberate, and then he was in the doorway, and he was looking at his desk, and the ledger open on it, and then he was looking at her. His face went through several things very quickly. She watched all of them. Mrs. Wade? His voice was controlled. What are you doing in my office? I found a significant discrepancy in the accounts receivable yesterday afternoon, she said. I was looking for the corresponding source documentation, and I found this. She gestured at the ledger. I recognized immediately that it was a separate record. I haven't touched the entries. I've been sitting here since 6:30 waiting for you to arrive so I could bring it to your attention. It was technically true. Every word of it was technically true. She watched him understand that, watched him process the position he was in, which was the position of a man whose evidence was sitting open on his desk in the presence of a witness who had found it in the normal course of employment. Close the door, he said. I'd prefer to leave it open. She kept her voice level. I'm not comfortable in closed offices with men I don't know well. I hope you understand. He looked at her, and she looked back, and they were both in that moment exactly as clear about what was happening as the other. The performance stripped away the board visible. You've been working toward this since the beginning, he said. I've been doing my job since the beginning. She paused. The ledger was in your desk. I found it. What it contains is not my construction. You went to Cheyenne. Agnes Whitfield went to Cheyenne. I don't control Agnes's actions. He moved toward the desk, and she stood, and the standing was important, the physical statement of it. She was not going to sit while he came toward her. Step back from the desk, she said. He stopped. Something in her voice had changed, and he heard it, the thing that had been growing under the surface of 3 weeks of careful performance, the part of her that had spent 6 years waiting for the moment when she would not have to be careful anymore. You don't give instructions in my bank, he said. I'm not giving instructions. I'm telling you that there is a territorial court examiner arriving in this town this morning with documentation of your fraudulent practices, and that this ledger is going to be in his hands within the hour, and that the most useful thing you can do right now is step back from that desk and let the law work. She held his gaze. Because the alternative, Mr. Slade, is that you do something this witness will be required to report, and that transforms a financial fraud case into something considerably more serious. The word witness landed. He looked past her at the open office door, through the outer office, through the front glass of the bank where Callum Wade was visible on the boardwalk, not moving, not looking away. Slade looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He looked at Callum. He sat down in his chair. Ellie breathed. The examiner, a thin man named Garrett from the Territorial Court office, arrived at 9:45 with Sheriff Booker and 2 deputies. Agnes was behind them, and behind Agnes was Reginald Marsh, which was not something Ellie had anticipated, and she felt the surprise of it move through her before she understood what she was seeing. Marsh's face was different from any face she'd seen on him before. Not the controlled face, or the disappointed face, or the afraid face. Something older and more tired than all of them, the face of a man who has decided to stop carrying something because it has gotten too heavy. He walked past her without stopping and went to Garrett and handed him a document. She couldn't hear what was said. She watched Garrett read the document, watched his expression, watched him look up at Marsh and then at Slade. Agnes appeared at her elbow. He went to Booker this morning, Agnes said quietly. Before we arrived. He gave a sworn statement confirming the July meetings with Slade, the payments he received, the nature of the arrangement. She paused. He named Slade as the architect of all of it, and himself as an accessory. Ellie was quiet for a moment. She looked at her uncle across the room, at the tired, specific face of a man putting down a weight. He'll still face charges, she said. Yes, Booker's taking him in this afternoon. He knows it. Agnes paused. He asked me to tell you that his laboratory records are available to you. The formulas, the compound documentation, everything in your handwriting over 6 years. He's signing them over. She absorbed that. It was not forgiveness. It was not repair. It was not close to sufficient. But it was something. It was the action of a man who understood what he owed and was paying what portion of it was still payable. Tell him I heard, she said. Garrett spent 40 minutes in Slade's office with the ledger, and Ellie's copies, and the sworn statement from Marsh, and the documentation Agnes had been accumulating for 2 years. Slade sat in the chair beside his desk for all of it, with the stillness of a man who has understood that the situation is no longer manageable. When Garrett came out, he spoke to Booker, and Booker spoke to his deputies, and then Booker went into the office, and Slade came out of it between 2 deputies and was walked down the main street of Harlan Creek, in the flat white October morning, and the town watched. Ellie stood on the boardwalk in front of the bank and watched too. She watched until Slade was through the door of the sheriff's office and the door had closed, and then she looked down at her hands. The healed cuts barely visible now, the bandages long gone, the skin closed and smooth. Callum was beside her. He'd been there since Garrett arrived, close enough that she could feel his presence without looking that specific warmth that she'd stopped cataloging as remarkable because it had become instead simply constant. It's done, he said. It's done. She let out a breath that seemed to have been held for 3 weeks for 6 years, for longer than she had clean language to describe. The railroad deal falls through without the acquisition documentation. The properties that were illegally foreclosed will need to go through the territorial court for restitution. That'll take time, but they have a path. Cooper's cousin lost his property 8 months ago, Callum said. Faulty assessment early call-in. He's been living in his brother's barn. He'll get it back. She turned to look at him. I want to build something here. A proper practice. The town has Doc Ferris, but he's 60, and he's the only physician in 40 miles. She paused. I have 6 years of compound documentation coming to me. I have the knowledge. I want to build something that's mine. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried look that she had come to understand was the most honest thing about him. The look that saw what was actually there. This town could use it, he said. The ranch could use it too. You lose livestock to illness and injury because there's no one close enough to call. She held his gaze. I can build a practice here and work the ranch. I've been working both for 3 weeks already. You have. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about something. Tell me. The arrangement. He said the word carefully. The terms we agreed to that first night. She waited. I want to renegotiate. The morning was cold, and the town was going about its business around them, and Agnes was talking to Garrett 20 feet away. And none of it touched the particular quality of that moment on the boardwalk, the two of them standing in the October light, with everything said that needed to be said in order to arrive here. What terms are you proposing? She asked. He looked at her with something open in his face, open and steady and fully present in the specific way he was only occasionally fully present, the way she'd first seen in the barn with the horses, the way she'd seen twice before when he'd said things he meant completely. I'm not looking to replace what I had, he said. I know that. I said it the first night, and it's still true. He paused. But I've been dead inside for 18 months, and I have not been dead inside for the last 3 weeks, and I think you know that, and I think you're not indifferent to it. I'm not indifferent to it, she said. Then I'm proposing that we stop calling it an arrangement. He paused. I'm proposing that we call it what it is. She thought about what Doc Ferris had said, exhausted and mildly underfed, and learning not to carry so much alone. She thought about Callum at the gate on the Milligan Road, just standing there, having walked out to meet her, because Agnes had told him, and he'd needed to be there. She thought about 2 a.m. at the kitchen table with a notebook between them, working the problem together, which was the most intimate thing she'd ever experienced, more intimate than anything she had language for yet. What would you call it? She asked. Home, he said. I'd call it home. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had opened a door in the dark without asking why she was there, who had cleaned her hands and asked what specifically can you do, and meant it as a question about capability, not a measure of worth, who had said it'll be because you decide it, and had kept that promise every day since, without requiring acknowledgement for the keeping of it. She thought about all the things she still didn't know how to do. How to stop checking the locks. How to accept kindness without waiting for the cost. How to sleep through the night without listening. She thought about the fact that those were things she was learning slowly and imperfectly, and that learning them here in this house with this man was the specific form the learning had taken, and she could not imagine it taking any other form now. All right, she said. All right, he said. He held out his hand, not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just his hand extended the way he'd extended it the first morning when she'd come back from the bunkhouse, the simple physical fact of it, the offer of steadiness. She took it. Agnes appeared at their side, practical and unsentimental and deeply satisfied in the manner of a woman who has been working towards something for a long time and is watching it arrive. Garrett wants statements from both of you this afternoon, she said. Formal on record. Can you be at Booker's office at 2? We'll be there, Callum said. Agnes looked at their joined hands and said nothing, which from Agnes was the equivalent of a considerable speech. They walked back to the ranch together in the late morning, the town behind them and the open range ahead, and the Wade property sitting in its valley, with the new barn frame visible against the sky, still half-built, the lumber purchased 2 weeks ago from the territorial court's initial seizure of Slade's assets, a process Agnes had moved with remarkable speed. The frame was rough and skeletal, and entirely real. Cooper was on the porch step leg, fully healed, mending harness with the focused industry of a man who had been given permission to be useful. He looked up when they came through the gate. He looked at their hands. He looked at Callum's face and then at Ellie's face. "Well," he said, "about time." "Cooper," Callum said, "I'm just observing." "Observe more quietly." "Yes, sir." Cooper bent back to the harness and then looked up once more. "Miss Marsh, you ever going to learn to make biscuits?" "No," Ellie said. "Didn't think so." He nodded as though this confirmed something important. "Good thing the rest of it worked out then." Ellie looked at the barn frame. She looked at the ranch house with its 2 rooms and its kitchen and its spare quality of a place that had been waiting for something to fill it. She looked at Callum beside her, at the lines of his face that she had learned in 3 weeks, the way she'd learned the medicinal compounds by observation and attention, and the particular knowledge that some things need to be understood completely to be used correctly. She thought about the girl who had pounded on a door in the dark with bleeding hands, who had stood in a stranger's kitchen calculating exits, who had held her medicine bag against her chest like it was the last thing in the world that was hers. That girl had been right about one thing. It was the last thing that was hers. It was the only real thing she owned. She still owned it. She owned it more completely now than she had then, because she understood now that ownership of the self was not a static condition, but a practice, something you did every day by making choices that were yours, by standing in rooms and speaking clearly, and taking up the exact space you were entitled to without apology. She was standing in her space now, her feet on the ground of a ranch in Wyoming territory that she had helped save beside a man who had asked what she could do and meant it in a life she had not been given, but had chosen one specific decision at a time, starting with a door in the dark and a fist that pounded rather than knocked. Eleanor Marsh had run from Denver with $80 stolen and a medicine bag, and a lie she hadn't finished telling herself. Eleanor Wade stood in the October sun and owned every inch of where she'd arrived. She was no one's debt, no one's leverage, no one's piece on a board she hadn't agreed to play on. She was home, and she had gotten there herself, and that was the only kind of home that ever truly holds.